Καλησπέρα σε όλους. Σας καλωσορίζω στην απόψινή εκδήλωση της Διδασκαλικής Ομοσπονδίας Ελλάδας.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Greek Federation of Primary Teachers. We are very happy to have with us Mrs. Diane Ravich. We are going to start with a very short introduction to explain to you the process of today's meeting. In November 8, 2021, the board of our federation, in the framework of its fight against the authoritarian policies of the Ministry of Education regarding evaluation, the anti-educative evaluation of laws of the year 2020 and 2021, organized an online scientific event titled Educative Work and Evaluation, Scientific Approaches, with the professors Mr. Barakis, Mrs. Traianou, who is also here with us today, Mr. Pavlidis, Mrs. Avgitidou, and Mr. Turtouras. For decades now, the Federation believes that the trade unionism has to be supported by very well-documented scientific discourse. This has led to a series of scientific events and research and conferences and also publications. Within this framework, today we have a very important online scientific event aiming at giving the opportunity to the Greek educators to understand which are the words of a person who has lived through all the stages of what we call anti-educative evaluation. It is my honor to welcome Mrs. Diane Ravich, professor at the University of New York, historian of education and research of education policy. Dear Mrs. Ravich, we are very enthusiastic that you have given some of your valuable time today in order to share with us your views. Because for Greek educators opposing against the policies of the Ministry of Education regarding the imposition of a system of evaluation for school units and educators, the only target not to support education in their work, but also to support the public good of education. Starting from June 2020, when the Parliament voted Law 4692, the Ministry of Education, ignoring fully the proposals of our federation for a process of evaluation that will not classify schools and educators, but will support the actual educative work, understanding school as a cell of creation and learning, has proceeded with laws and ministerial decisions without any dialogue with our federations whatsoever. This is an authoritarian action, devaluating our work and our federations, which institutionalize the internal and external evaluation of school units and educators themselves. Via these provisions, the educators, the schools, the students, pupils, and their families are becoming the guilty party. Whatever is wrong within the education, for whatever is wrong in the education. Quantification of evaluative scales can be instrumentalized very easily in order to categorize school units and educators based on the general plans of the government as shown by their own program before the elections and the very cautious reading of the provisions of the law. there is a risk to connect the financing of schools, free choice of a school unit by the parents, transportation options. These are some of the risks that we face. After that, we had an attack from the minister and the secretary general of the ministry in order to create a climate of fear and terror for those who support and adopt the legal decisions of our federation. Against all the aforementioned, our weapons are our faith to our fight to support the public character of education and the documented pedagogical view for our targets. So welcome, Mrs. Ravage. We, of course, would like to have you in person with us, but nevertheless, this is a very good opportunity to have you with us online. This is the first online scientific speech, which coincides with the 100 years of the establishment of our federation. So this year, we're going to have a series of events, and we hope that in some of these, you will be present as well. Before going any further, let me introduce to you the members of the board and our other colleagues. Mrs. Anna Traianou, professor of the Goldsmith in University in London, is going to moderate today's event. And the members of the board who are present here, the General Secretary of the Federation, Mrs. Stavros Dimitrakis, the Deputy President, Mr. Yorgos Troulis, the General Secretary, Mr. Thanasis Koumas, our cashier, Mr. Marcos Androulakis, the Special Secretary, Mrs. Zisis Tsapranas, the Publication Officer, Mrs. Yota Diamantopoulou, and the members Giannis Anagnostaras and Mathos Kyriakopoulos. Before going forward and opening the floor, I would like to say that we have a large audience. They can write their their questions throughout the speech, the lecture. The chat function is going to be utilized for this. We are going to group the questions so that Mrs. Ravage will be able to respond to all of them. This way, we will be able, within the limited time that we have with us, approximately 1 hour, to have the opportunity to conclude this process and reach some conclusions. So I wish success to this event, and thank you, Mrs. Ravage, again. Mrs. Traianou, you have the floor to open the event.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I wish that I could be with you instead of in Brooklyn, New York, but it's very nice to speak with you. And I know very little about Greek education, but I know a lot about American education. And I believe that the things that are happening in Greece today for your schools are very similar to what's been happening in the US now for decades. And I'll give you the background. Beginning in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was our president, he was in favor of vouchers. He did not like public education, although he himself was a product of public education. And he created a commission to figure out what was wrong with American education. Now, what was wrong was that the test scores. We have a national test to get into college called the SAT. And the SAT scores had dropped. And the reason they had dropped, most people think, is because more and more children from very poor backgrounds were taking the test or were qualifying to apply to college. But the commission appointed by President Reagan said that American public schools were very mediocre, and they laid out a whole reform program of what needed to change. And at that time, they didn't say much about testing, and they talked about teachers needing more time for their education. They talked about rather common sense solutions that came through, and this was in 1983, was American public schools are failing. And that was like a clarion call to the governors of the 50 states to say, oh, we have a crisis. We have a crisis in education. Our public schools are failing. We, the governors, must take charge. We must get involved. And so there was several years of activity where governors became very prominent in education policy. And needless to say, they have very little knowledge of education or how to educate children. They wouldn't last a day in a classroom, but they were telling everyone else what to do. When George W. Bush became the president in the year 2000, when he was elected, he then imposed a federal program of national testing. This was not the first time schools had had tests. They've always had tests, but the test didn't have any particular consequences except in the individual classroom. So President George W. Bush passed a program called No Child Left Behind, in which the Congress of the United States required that every child in every school in the entire country, some 50 million children, will take tests every year, beginning in the 3rd grade and continuing into the 8th grade. And teachers, although the unions supported this and they said, yes, we need accountability, we need to see improvement. And so this was fastened upon the country by the federal government. And so there continued to be this drumbeat, this constant refrain that our public schools are failing. And people would pick up pieces of data and they'd say, well, look at the international test scores, we're just at average. We used to be number 1 and now we're average. Well, the reality was American students never did well on the international test because we have a very, very wide degree of income inequality. And the poorest children get the lowest scores and the wealthiest children get the highest scores. It was a long time before I understood that this separation on test scores is a mirror of the economic separation. In any event, George W. Bush, president from 2000 to 2008, imposed this national requirement that all schools had to test every single child from 3rd through 8th grade. And so every year the scores would come out and people would say, oh my goodness, the scores are too low. The scores are low. Well, the scores didn't get higher, or the scores got a little bit higher, but everyone became obsessed with test scores. And so when part of the Bush program was that if a school didn't make progress every single year towards 100% proficiency, if a school did not make that progress, the school could be closed. And so I don't know whether it was hundreds or thousands of schools were closed, and they were the schools that served the poorest and neediest children. They were the schools that had the most children with disabilities, the most children who couldn't speak or read English, and the most children who lived in poverty. So many of those schools were closed, the children were sent somewhere else. And at the same time, as testing became a very overwhelming influence in American education, the choice movement, the school movement became strong. Now, the school choice movement encompassed 2 types of schools, or really more than 2, but the basic 2 are, one is charter schools, and charter schools is when public money is given to private managers to run schools, and they are then freed from the rules and regulations that apply to public schools. But because they have public money, these charter schools, they call themselves public schools, but they're really draining the public schools of the students, the best students, and also resources. The other kind of choice that's been was revived in the 1980s and 1990s was vouchers. And vouchers is very unpopular with voters, but it's become very an important policy, particularly to Republican politicians. We have 2 main parties here. The Democrats are generally progressive and on the liberal. I won't say left because they're not left, they're liberal. And Republicans are conservative, and under the influence of President Trump, went very far to the right. So the people on the right, the Republicans, the Libertarians, the Conservatives, support vouchers and they actually oppose public education. They want children to have free choice. They think the public should pay for homeschooling, where a child never even goes to school. And the public should pay for, this is what the right now believes, the public should pay for any type of school, whether it operates for profit, for nonprofit, whether it's a charter or religious school, or any other sort of school, or as I said, a homeschool, or even a virtual school. A virtual charter school is basically beaming lessons into the home on the internet, and the charter operator makes a lot of money because they get tuition. So that we have now a wide range of alternatives to public education that were promoted, first of all, by Republicans. But then the Obama administration, which everyone expected would be very liberal because it should have been, but the Obama administration embraced the idea of charters and generally of school choice. The Obama administration did not support vouchers because of we have traditionally in this country an idea that church and state should be separate and that public money should not go to church schools. But the Republicans have been pushing very hard to overthrow that principle. During the Obama administration, the Education Department pushed for charter schools and really hoped to solidify support for the idea of school choice amongst some number of Democrats. So the people who should have been fighting to defend and protect public education, the Democrats, found themselves, because of President Obama and his Department of Education, supporters of charters as school choice, and thinking that charters somehow had some magic where they could take a school of children who had very low test scores and very low achievement. And because they are charters, they had the magic, whatever the magic sauce was, that would cause them to become high-performing students within 2, 3, or 5 years. So the Obama administration poured many millions of dollars into supporting charters. The Obama administration was very, very devoted to standardized testing. And it was during the Obama administration that the Secretary of Education at that time, his name is Arne Duncan, that he put forth a program that said to the 50 states, I have a $5 billion that I'm going to have as a contest. And in order to participate in the contest for that money, you have to increase the number of charter schools. You must evaluate teachers by the test scores of their students. And you must adopt national standards. And we had no national standards at that point, but our billionaire Bill Gates subsidized the creation of what he hoped would be national standards. So what I see coming together in these events, because after Obama, we went to Trump, and Trump was a supporter of and anything that would disrupt and diminish the public schools. And he brought in as Secretary of Education a woman who is a billionaire and who is a rabid proponent of religious education. So we've been through a long and difficult period for public schools. Teachers have been particularly affected because of the push for evaluation. The idea behind evaluation, which Bill Gates and the Obama administration together worked very hard to get it into the laws in almost every state, that based on test scores, teachers would be evaluated. And if the test scores went up, you were a good teacher. And if the test scores went down, you were a bad teacher. And if they stayed the same, well, you could hang on a while longer. Now, there are certain kinds of themes that play out behind all of this. One is that the test scores and the testing process becomes it becomes the driver of education. All the decisions are based around test scores. If your test scores are low, your school may be closed. If you're a teacher and the test scores of your students go down, you may be fired. If you are a teacher and the kids' test scores go up, you may get a bonus. I mean, everything became test scores. And as a result of this, we saw a narrowing of the curriculum. The only subjects that mattered were the test scores of mathematics and reading, and science not so much, and history not so much. But those were not the tested subjects, only math and reading. And so we saw the curriculum become narrowed. We saw teachers looking at last year's test and any test they could find that had been used and teaching to that test. And that narrowed teaching, it narrowed curriculum. And as more and more states adopted this method, and after this method, it was called value-added measurement, VAM. So after value-added measurement was applied over the years, and it started about 10 years ago, here's what happened. One was that we learned, as we should have known beforehand, that the teachers who got the best ratings were in the most affluent school districts, in the most affluent neighborhoods. They were teaching children whose parents were college educated. They were teaching children who had no disabilities. They were teaching children who came from the most comfortable affluent homes. Those were really great teachers. On the other hand, teachers whose students had handicaps, or whose students were new citizens and barely spoke any English at all, and students, especially students in poverty, their teachers looked like bad teachers because they seldom saw the kind of test score growth that the other teachers did. And then it was then that I think they spoke up, and the politicians simply didn't listen. And what the social scientists said was the test scores above all reflect the home environment. The teacher has some influence. Some of the statisticians actually broke it down and said the teacher has an impact of about 15% of the students' test scores. The school itself and its curriculum has another impact, but the largest impact comes from the home environment and whether the student feels supported at home, feels he or she will have a food and a home to live in. There's a certain kind of basic economic security that supports higher academic achievement, and basic insecurity and living in a very unstable situation at home and having parents who are, let's say, having parents with a large vocabulary versus parents with a very limited vocabulary, et cetera. All of these things have an impact on student test scores, and student test scores turn out to be an incredibly unreliable and invalid way to assess the quality of teachers. And I recall that while the Obama administration was very strongly in favor of assessing teachers by test scores, the unions didn't like it and they were not listened to. And various teachers began going to court and suing, and some of their lawsuits were successful. In the city of Houston, Texas, for instance, the teachers there got a successful ruling from the judge who said, this formula that the city is using to rate teachers is completely indecipherable. It's inscrutable. They can't understand how they're being evaluated, and neither can I. So he declared this method of evaluating teachers to be invalid. On the other hand, in Florida, the state of Florida, teachers there, the union sued because they had this strange outcome in which teachers who had been Teacher of the Year, who were very successful, were given very low ratings. And they brought a lot of evidence to the court, and the court said, well, this evaluation system may be unfair, but it's not unconstitutional. So it was left in place in that state. So what we have now is a hodgepodge where teacher evaluation by test score goes on in some places, not in others. But I'd say that on the whole, it has had a very demoralizing impact on teachers because they know that teaching involves more than just test scores, that what they do with children is very labor intensive, it's very personal, it involves the whole child, not just the test score child. And that a very poor teacher might be in a district where she or he is lucky enough to get the scores to go up by very bad educational practice. But the scores don't measure the quality of a teacher. And I think that even Bill Gates learned this because he sunk hundreds of millions, if not billions, into experiments with teacher evaluation in several districts, where he underwrote this program over a period of years. And at the end, they found that the really good teachers didn't want to teach kids who might pull their scores down. And many teachers were demoralized. And it had absolutely no effect whatever on student test scores to evaluate their teachers by test scores. I mean, the assumption behind this was that if you use a carrot and a stick and a whip and you threaten teachers' livelihoods, they would then become better teachers and the test scores would go up. Well, none of this made any sense. It was ridiculous. Threatening teachers did not make students work harder and did not produce higher scores, except in cases of cheating. And we've seen a fair amount of that as well when so much is riding on a test. So the state of things today is that the federal government continues to require a test of every child every year as part of the federal law. And we had thought, or many educators had thought, that Biden promised to get rid of the annual test, but he has not. This federal government continues to be a very heavy funder of charter schools. And let me just say a few things about school choice, because I know this is a concern that you have. We now have charter schools for 30 years in the United States. These are schools that are run by management operations. They're corporations that are national, some of them are local. Some of them operate for profit, some of them don't. Some of them are nonprofit, but hire a for-profit operator to get a profit by running the school. What's happened is that a tremendous amount of taxpayer money is now going in, that was intended for public use, is now going to private operators who are not transparent, not especially accountable. The for-profit operators are making huge amounts of money, partly on tuition, but mostly on real estate. They buy and sell schools, they buy and sell properties, they buy properties, become their own landlord, raise their rent, and there are just a million and one schemes that private sector operators have come up with to siphon public money away from children. The charter schools do not perform better than the public schools. Many of them are much, much worse than the public schools that the children have left to go to the charter schools. The voucher schools are another story. The voucher schools are usually very low quality schools. They're usually, more often than not, they're religious schools. Their teachers are very often not certified. And whereas the public schools are subject to this very minimum of accountability for test scores, the voucher schools are not tested at all. Sometimes they have to take a test, but it's not the same state test that the public schools take. And so it's very hard to make comparisons. However, there have been a number of research studies of voucher schools, because we've had vouchers in several cities and now in a number of states for 25 or so years. And the studies show that kids who leave a public school and go to a voucher school, whether it's religious or non-religious, that they tend to get lower test scores than the kid than those who remain behind in public school. So they're actually harmed by going to a voucher school. The chances are that they don't have a certified teacher. The private schools don't have unions. 90% of the charter schools do not have unions. In fact, I've come to the conclusion that one of the reasons that we have so many incredibly wealthy people supporting the school choice movement is because school choice usually leads to eliminating the union. There are a few charters that have, where the employees have unionized, but they're a very small proportion of the 6,000 or 7,000 charters in the country. Probably 250 of them have unions at the insistence of their teachers. But as you can see, if there are 7,000 charters and there are 250 of them are unionized, the charters serve as a very useful way of getting rid of the union. And the voucher schools, I don't know of a voucher school anywhere that is unionized. And they're in the private sector, there may be only one or two or a handful of schools that have a union. So a lot of this privatization, what's behind it, and the reason it gets huge contributions from libertarian billionaires and even mainstream billionaires is that it's union busting. One of the biggest funders of school choice in the United States is the Walton family, which owns Walmart. And they put every year millions and millions of dollars into supporting charter schools, organizations that advocate on behalf of school choice, and also an organization called Teach for America. And Teach for America has an international arm called Teach for All, and they have an outlet or a similar organization in most countries in the world. I assume there must be a Teach for Greece, but the basic idea is that young people can leave college at the end of the spring semester, in May or whenever this college year is over. And then they have 6 weeks of training to be a teacher. And a few months after they graduate college, they're placed in a very tough school where they get a regular teacher's salary. They sign a contract to teach only years. So a few stay, most leave. They network, it's an American term. I assume it can be translated into Greece, but they make very good relationships and connections as a result of being part of Teach for America. And then they can go into banking or law or go to graduate school, find their real career. But they, with few exceptions, they are not planning to be career teachers. So Teach for America has been the basic staffing of the charter sector. There are about 7,000 charters. They could not have found adequate teachers without Teach for America producing this steady supply of young people who wanted to try their hand at education for 2 years. So all of these things have come together to demoralize teachers, and the combination of this now long-term, well, at least 30 years, if not longer, effort to disrupt public schools to think that their problems are with their teachers and not with their funding and not with the poverty in which so many children now live. Teachers are a scapegoat, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. And that's why teacher evaluation has emerged as an incredibly pernicious issue, because it's a way of saying if the scores are not high enough, and if there's a gap between the rich and the poor or between children of different races, it must be because of bad teachers. What social scientists would say is, since most of the test scores are a reflection of home environment, it must be because of poverty and inequality and racial segregation. So the effects of what I believe the intent of school choice is to change the subject. And instead of addressing the real problems in our society, in our education system, which to me are start long before kids go to school. And when kids arrive in school, the differences in their socioeconomic background is already very clear. But one way that the very wealthy have found to try to keep their taxes lower and also to evade the real problems is to focus on things like teacher evaluation and school choice. And they are obsessed with testing and data. And what all of this does, a couple things. One is that it demoralizes teachers. Another is that it gets us locked in, obsessed with this idea that data can give us the answer to everything. And all data does is to reflect the status quo, which is that rich kids do very, very well on the test, the standardized test. The poor kids do very poorly on the standardized test because they have very different situations that cause them to either get high or low scores. I spent 7 years on our own national testing board, and the national tests are given not to every child, but to a sample of children. And when these reforms that I've been describing, which are not reforms, they're really disruptions, but when all of this push for evaluation and for more test scores and evaluating teachers by scores, charters, vouchers, all of this reached a sort of a peak in 2010. And on the national test, sample tests are not given to every child, but on the national test, performance has been flat for the last 11 years. And I would conclude from that, as have others, that all of this so-called reform and disruption has not improved schools. It's just disrupted them. And it's pushed the idea that many parents now accept that they should be able to choose what school their child goes to. And, you know, a lot of parents have always had a choice. It's just that you had to pay for it. And now what they're saying is we want to have a private choice and we want the government to pay for it. We want to send our child to a religious school, or we want to send, they never ever have the choice to send their child to an elite private school, because the voucher that's made available by states that have vouchers is never equal to the tuition at the very best private schools. So people get a voucher and they have a choice of not very good private schools or ill-equipped and understaffed religious schools. So it's, in my mind, this is all a great hoax, that if we were serious about educating kids, we would spend more money on where the needs are greatest. I think one of the questions that was posed to me was, or one of the ideas was that the resources follow success. You know, that's crazy, because that says that if you have affluent kids with minimal needs, you get more money than a school that has the neediest children. We do have federal laws or federal programs that give more money to the neediest schools, but to compare, even those children are in very overcrowded schools and overcrowded classes. And if we were serious about educational change, we would focus on the very best public education that was available to all. And one of the foundational democratic ideas in the United States in its founding was that there would be the same educational opportunities available to everyone. Now, that was not in our Constitution, and it took time to come about, because we had originally no public schools when our country was founded. But over the past, since the 1770s, public education has been one of the central institutions that have made our country democratic. There are places where people of different economic groups and different social and racial groups meet one another and learn to live in the same space and to be friends and cooperate with one another. But this ideal is being undermined by school choice, which is supporting segregation and is serving as a reason not to fund public schools out, because so much money is being siphoned off for privatization. So much money is going to schools that in many cases are all white or all black or all something else. And school choice, as I see it, looking at the long picture of American education, is a way of evading problems, not solving them. So on that note, I will stop and I will invite your questions. And if I've missed anything, please feel free to ask me.
Professor Ravitch, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. You brought up so many important issues for not just for Greece, but for the whole Europe. Privatization, the effects of privatization, school autonomy and accountability on teachers and schools. it's interesting, and from my point of view, to understand why we have come to this place, to this point, and why is it that on the one hand we've got still governments and supranational organizations like the OECD promoting these policies, when on the other hand we've got studies, and your work is included into this, which actually have established a very strong relationship between this global movement of reform and increasing inequalities. So that remains a theme for discussion and a question for further exploration. I will.
Well, I think it's important to say, excuse me, I think it's important to say that the OECD has not played a helpful role in improving education, because the constant pressure to get a higher test score drives this movement. And my very, very dear friend Pasi Sahlberg from Finland has written about the horse race. And he said, you know, I met him when Finland scored #1 on the, I forget if it was TEMS or PISA, those are the two big tests, but Finland scored #1. And I went to meet at the Finnish General Consul's home in New York, and Pasi Sahlberg was there, and he was representing the Finnish government. And I said, well, to what do you attribute this great success? And he said, we don't test children in our schools, and our teachers don't care about tests. They don't know what they don't give standardized tests. The kindergarten through 9th grade is a test-free arena, no tests. And I said, well, why did the children do so well? He said, well, we take care of them. They have free medical care. They have 3 meals a day if they want it at school. They have lots of time for play. They don't even start school until around 7. Meanwhile, they're actually in school before 7, but it's all play. It's not academics. Meanwhile, in the United States, we are giving standardized tests to 5-year-olds. And, you know, to me, if the tests were to disappear tomorrow, if the OECD would say, we're not going to test anymore, we would all be better off, because aim for, when you understand that the tests themselves are just a reflection of socioeconomic status, and we learn nothing from them. And we particularly learn nothing from standardized tests, because the best test is a test the teacher makes, because the teacher knows what he or she was teaching for the previous month, 6 weeks, semester. So if they test what they taught, then they learn something. They find out which children learned it and which didn't learn. And if they get the results of a standardized test, they learn nothing from the results of a standardized test. It doesn't, the way it works, at least in the US, is that the teachers they learn the score, but they don't learn what students did or did not get right. They don't learn about their student errors, because all of this is proprietary information. The testing companies don't want to release their questions, and they certainly don't release it for individual students. So the teacher learns nothing. All they have is a score, and they say your child is now in the 43rd percentile or the 89th percentile. What does this mean? It means nothing.
Yes, it does. It does mean nothing. I agree with you. My experience from England is very close to what you've said. We do have a few questions in the chat here. Can I start with the first question? It revolves around teachers' morale. You talked about a demoralizing teaching profession. So one question related to the extent to which teachers resign from their profession, the same way, for example, that happens in England.
Well, we have a very serious problem. I suspect it's a global problem. That is that if you take together the trends that I've been discussing of using really spurious or false methods of evaluating teachers, that's a demoralizing factor. And then you add to that a pandemic that's been going on for 2 years, and I haven't mentioned the pandemic. Teachers have been, you know, you're in school, you have masks, no, you're out of school, now you're going to do everything online, and now you're back in school and you're going to have some students online and some students in, and in many districts, there have been battles about, at least in the US, there have been battles about masks. It's become a political issue. And if you're a follower of Donald Trump, then you say, no one's going to put a mask on me. I'm not going to wear a mask. My child's not going to wear a mask. And then they go to school board meetings and they scream at the school board members who think the children should wear masks. So this has become a very political issue, and it's very hard for teachers because some teachers don't want to teach if the kids are not masked, which makes sense. Others don't want to be masked. I mean, it's become such an insane political thing, and you know, you might as well say, in our country, people drive on the left side of the road, but I'm free, so I'm going to drive on the other side of the road. Well, you can't do that. You know, life is filled with things that we have to do that we may prefer not to do. I mean, there's a certain way you don't go out barefoot in the winter, but common sense should tell you that.
Well, yes. So thank you. There is a comment which again relates to the role of the OECD and the growing involvement of supranational organizations, just such as the OECD and the World Bank. And the comment is asking you actually to respond to the to say your views. How do you comment on the growing involvement of supranational organizations in shaping educational policies, even at the national level, with econometric logic and emphasis on measurable data, ignoring qualities that exist in every pedagogical relationship that exists in every educational process? Long question.
Well, it's a big question, and I think it gets at an important problem today, which is the effort by people, mostly who are not educators, to control education and to control teachers. And I see this all the time in this country, where people have made a profession of calling themselves educators, even though they've never been in a classroom other than as a student themselves. And so we have a lot of consulting businesses. The OECD has played a very powerful role in driving these market forces. It's a combination of what we're seeing is a combination of standardization, market forces, and all of this has the effect of taking agency away from teachers. Teachers should be able to manage their classroom, and to say they are not being evaluated where there's someone who hired them. Usually it's called the principal. So they are evaluated by their principal, and that's someone who sees them, how they interact with the students, what kind of work is in their classroom, what kind of student work is posted on the walls. Is their classroom well organized, and is it one that is in chaos? I mean, these are things that someone sees with their eyes, and they can make an evaluation based on the quality of the work that they see in the classroom. This is very different from turning evaluation over to an algorithm. So I think that in all of this, we see the infusion of data, of an effort to standardize education, in which the teacher is just a puppet. The teacher has no control. And what I've seen from my own studies of what they do, they have to be well prepared. But once they're well prepared, the thing that is most motivating for teachers is having autonomy in their classroom. And what the movement with OECD and all of these other supranational organizations is to remove agency from teachers. Now, part of this may be, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but part of this may be an intentional effort to make schools cheaper by having fewer teachers and more technology. And so if there were fewer teachers, I don't know if they'd be paid more or not. They might not be paid more, but it would cut costs. And what a lot of very wealthy people are very upset about is that schools cost so much. And when you ask about their own child is going to a school that costs maybe 8 to 10 times as much as we spend on the average public school student. So they have no problem running a school that has only 12 children in a classroom, but they don't want public schools to be like that. But the longer term issue is driving teachers out of the profession and replacing them with technology. And I see this as a real possibility and maybe even a strategy.
Yeah. Right. Oh, it may not happen. I hope it doesn't happen. Okay. There are a few questions, more questions, but they are in Greek, so ask the translation, the English translation. And I hope that's okay for everyone.
According to your experience, how certification of the educational system may be put in place without affecting the public education sector and the public education system? Are you okay?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, it's got to do with the value of certification, right?
Yes, there's a question which revolves around how can we verify, yes, the quality, how can we assess the quality of teachers' work or education without damaging the public education?
Well, I think that it's crucial that people who are going to teach have very, very good teacher education. And I got my graduate degree in a teacher's college, Columbia University. And it's very important that people understand education, understand child psychology, that they study the subjects, and that people have built up over many generations to make better educators, and that there be some sort of a certification exam, not a standardized test. I think that people in training to be teachers should have practice teaching and should have sponsors, mentors, and they should have the endorsement of their mentor that they're prepared to teach. And there also should be a screen in which they can demonstrate basic literacy, but not such a hard test that it screens out people because they're not, PhDs and scholars. We've had problems with standardized testing for teachers, and the problem of bringing people into the profession with the standardized is that it reflects a standardized test for students. The standardized test is designed to discriminate, and people don't really understand that. If you take a test to drive a car, almost everyone can pass that test if they can drive a car. If you take a standardized test, it's designed so that half of the people who take it will be on top and half will be on bottom. It is designed to weed people out. And I think we're approaching a very, very difficult and dangerous point right now where, because of demoralization, many people are leaving the classroom. The number of people applying to come into teaching has dropped very precipitously for one reason, the pandemic and the jeopardy that teachers believe they're in, and teachers in many cases have not been protected. And plus the pressures of high stakes testing and standardized testing, all of this has been very hard. So we're approaching a teacher shortage. And we may already be in a teacher shortage because many of the schools in the US can't even hire substitutes. And because of the Omicron surge, there are many bus drivers who are not driving buses. And so you don't need to pass the test to be a bus driver if you have a driver's license, because you've already passed the test. But to be a teacher, you should be screened, but not by a standardized test, because it's, as I believe, a useless instrument.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions to the practical side of the management of the charter schools.
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions which relate more to how charter schools are managed. For example, if schools don't get the right results, what happens to the funding? How they're funding, in other words. do some schools close as a result of a bad evaluation or a bad test test score outcome? And who funds each type of school? Do they have the same curriculum? Is the same the same provision for the maintenance of the school? Have the parents got any reasons? What choices, what reasons do parents use in order to choose among schools? And how do they hire teachers? And is there any link between, there are too many, there's a bunch of questions here, as you can see. And is there a link between evaluation and pay, teachers' pay?
Let me start with the last one first. The evaluation was intended to affect teachers' pay and also their longevity, so that the evaluation based on test scores could be used to give an award. It's called merit pay. So if the teacher's scores went up more than was expected, they might get a bonus of $1,000 or $2,000. There is a lot of research on merit pay, and I've done some myself, and it never works. If the purpose of merit pay is to raise the test scores of the children, it doesn't work. I mean, it's been tried for over 100 years, and the assumption, it comes from the business world, like so many of the ideas, bad ideas coming into education. The assumption is that if you offer people a bonus, they will work harder, and therefore the scores will go up. But there's a disconnect there, because the teacher may be doing the best they can, and tying their saying that you'll get a bonus doesn't make them teach any better, because they're already teaching the best they know how. That they're not hiding their best lessons, So this, in order to get a higher test score, the student has to work harder, not the teacher. I mean, that's the irony, is but it also has been tried to offer rewards to students, and that evidently doesn't work either. There's a whole literature about giving bonuses to anyone, students or teachers, and why it's actually counterproductive. And in my last book, which is called Slaying Goliath, I had a chapter about what makes people work harder. And what makes people work harder is their own inner drive to do better. And so if you can tap into that self-motivation, you will get tremendous productivity, because people want to do better. But if you say, I'll give you money if you do better, then people say, great, I'll try harder. But then you say, I'm not giving you any more money. Then I'm not going to try at all. You've just taken something that they could have been encouraged to do out of their own free will and done well. And by offering to pay them for it, the motivation's there only as long as the money is there. So you change it from what one of the social scientists calls from the social motivation, which is I want to do well, to the market motivation, which is if you pay me, I'll try harder. And the market motivation kills the inner motivation. So anyway, that's what I know about merit pay, which is that it's been tried again and again. It always fails. As for the charter schools, what happens is that a means for an industry to be created. I mean, there have been there are organizations that have, one of them has 250 charters, so it's all over the country. There are others that have 20 charters, 30, 50, 100, but they're like a grocery store chain. And what they do is they go into a community and they say, if your child comes to our charter school, we can guarantee you they'll go to college. I mean, no public, it's marketing. I don't know if there's a word in Greek for marketing, but it's propaganda. It's business propaganda. It's like saying, my toothpaste is better than your toothpaste. And let me tell you why. Well, a public service is not like toothpaste. A public service is not a consumer good. And what the, what shall I call them? What these people supporting the charters and school have done is to try to create a consumer mentality. And so what they're replacing is what we would call a civic mentality. A civic mentality is what's good for most people. And let's support and fund public education because that's where almost 90% of the children are. And what the charters and voucher people have done together is to say, no, you have a right to choose. Everyone should have a choice. When you go to the grocery store, you have a choice. You can buy different cereals, you can buy different soaps, so forth. Why shouldn't you choose the school the way you choose soap? Well, the charter management companies, some of them have made just tremendous amounts of money. Some of them operate for profit. About, I think, probably close to 15% of our charters are operated for profit. And many of our nonprofits are operated by for-profit management companies. So for some of the people in the charter business, it really is a moneymaker. And the moneymaker of all is the virtual charter. And that's where the lessons are streamed and come into your home. And the teacher may have 200 students, but nobody knows how many students are online at one time. So the teacher gives the lesson, the kids are at home. You don't really know whether their screen is on. And there have been evaluations done by people who are actually quite pro-charter that have concluded that having classes online is like not going to school at all. So the one major evaluation of virtual charter schools said that a year in a charter school would cause a student to lose the equivalent of 44 days of reading and 180 days of mathematics. Well, 180 days is the whole year. So, it's like not sending your child to school at all. So what choice does is that it breaks up communities. It causes people to say, well, why should I support a neighborhood public school? I'm going to send my kid across town, and they'll go to this great charter school that promises to get my kid into college. Now, in the charter world, the rate of failure is extraordinarily high. Every year, there are charters that close. Some years there are hundreds of charters that close, and they're replaced by hundreds of other charters. So it's a little bit like turning a sector of education into a consumer business, like, let's say, a restaurant. My restaurant has better food at cheaper prices, and then you go there and you find out there's no food at all, and so they close. Then another one opens in the same location, and it says, well, I have even better food. There's constantly the sales pitch to parents. And the irony, one of the ironies in all of this is that any school can claim that if you graduate, you will go to college, because many colleges in the United States have no entrance requirements. So if students come through a charter that has really second-rate education, they can go to college if they want to foot the bill for going to college and pay the price, because there are so many open admissions colleges. So I think that very little has been gained from school choice. The idea of school choice in our country would be different from in others, although the concept has spread of free choice. And this is part of the kind of Milton Friedman libertarian world of choice will lead to better outcomes, but it doesn't. It actually leads to worse outcomes, since the charter schools on the whole don't produce higher scores, which is what they claim they do, and the voucher schools produce worse scores. So it really is a lot of effort put into offering something that makes very little difference other than to defund the public.
I've missed that.
I say that the huge amount of effort involved in having state legislatures authorize charters, authorize vouchers, send public money to organizations to distribute the money to private schools, all of this activity has no impact on improving education other than that it defunds the public schools, because there's only a certain amount of money that states are willing to spend and that the federal government spends. And when you divert it, some of it goes to charters, some of it goes to vouchers, and now some states want to pay people to keep their kids at home and have homeschooling. So all of this is money that doesn't go to public education.
Well, yes. The next and another question relates then to how much do you think the trade unions in the United States have defended, whether they have defended it sufficiently, defended public education sufficiently. There is a special reference to the mobilizations in the past 3 years with the slogan "Save Our Schools." And the person who wrote the question is asking you if you could describe those, tell us a little bit about these mobilizations and whether you think they had any effects, positive effect in society.
Well, the teachers unions, and we have two national teachers unions, are the largest unions remaining in the United States. We have had a very powerful and successful drive to kill off the unions. Not we, the people who don't like unions have worked very hard over the past 30 years, really since the Reagan administration, which would be the past 40 years. Reagan was the first to disband a union. It was the Air Traffic Controllers Union, and he broke a strike. And since then, industry has worked very hard with the support of right-wing billionaires who don't like unions. I mean, all of our biggest billionaires, with very few exceptions, are non-union, anti-union. I remember Steve Jobs, the inventor of Apple, said the way to improve schools was to get rid of the union. And so we hear a lot of this from people who, some of them claim to be liberals, and they're anti-union also. So the two big unions are the last big unions. And, you know, I think there are encouraging signs now to see occasional efforts to unionize in industries that have lost their unions. But the two teachers unions together have about 4 million members. And they wield some power in the Democratic Party, none whatever in the Republican Party. And they have been, I'd say, it's been hard for them because they're in such a small minority, and the labor movement itself has been weak. But I think that they have generally done a good job with this sole exception, and that is that when the union speaks up for the union, people will say, and their critics will say, you're just looking out for yourself. So it's been very important that resistance groups led by parents and by non-union teachers have been very important, because the parents are not in it for themselves. And when people speak up, whether it's from the National Education Association, which is the larger of the two, or the American Federation of Teachers, the media will always go to them and say, well, what's your answer to this? So they're the go-to, what's your answer? And then the other side will say, oh, well, that's just the union. They're only in it for themselves. They just want to see bigger paychecks for their members. They don't care about the children. So I think it's been very important that the unions have collaborated with groups like Save Our Schools. And I wrote about this in my last book, that in the state of Arizona, this is very, very conservative legislature and governor there. And the parents and just people who care about schools organized to fight a voucher referendum. The voucher referendum was funded by some of the major billionaires in the United States, DeVos family. She was Secretary of Education under Donald Trump, a billionaire, and Charles Koch. And Charles Koch owns a huge number of industries. I mean, almost anything you buy, there'll be a product by Koch Industries. But he's a billionaire, and when you have Charles Koch, and Betsy DeVos, and other billionaires throwing money into an election, it's very hard to overcome that. But they were beaten in Arizona by parents and teachers who got together to say, we don't want vouchers, because the public, when the issue is put clearly to the public will support public schools, not religious schools.
Thank you. There is a question, and next question revolves to you mentioned in your talk that those who are responsible for education policy in the United States, they don't take into account questions that are raised by the social sciences or results of social scientific research, at least not sufficiently. And do you think that this is on purpose, that the financial and political aims of the government are more important against critical thinking and research findings? And is there room for radical pedagogy, critical radical pedagogy in the public school system?
Two very different questions. I would say that the odds of getting radical critical pedagogy into the schools right now are very slim. We've been, since the last year of the Trump administration, the schools have been under attack for teaching about race and racism. And the critics have seized upon a term called critical race theory, which is something that's debated in law schools.
Yeah.
And it turns out that if you're very conservative and you're a Trump person, you really don't want to have any discussion of race in the schools, because they say it makes white children feel uncomfortable to discuss slavery. And we don't, so that literally there are about a dozen states now, about 12 of our 50 states, that have passed laws saying teachers shouldn't teach anything that makes children uncomfortable, or they should teach nothing that's divisive. Well, this is crazy, because you can't study history without becoming uncomfortable. Many terrible things have happened in many countries over the years, and many terrible things have happened in our country. And so the critics don't want any critical thinking taught. And it's very hard to imagine getting radical pedagogy into the classroom unless one is in a private school, which is probably where you'll find more of that than in the public schools, because people are worried about the oversight by government. Now, what was the first part of the question again?
Well, the question is why if you think that the governments on purpose choose to ignore social scientific research.
Yeah, I actually think usually it's mixed motives. There are people who probably think if we just these policies year after year, maybe they'll work someday. The fact that they fail consistently now for at least 20 years doesn't seem to matter. I think there's a problem of the testing mindset and the data mindset. And even people with good motives think, well, testing is the only way we'll know that some kids are doing poorly and other kids are doing well. Well, we already know that. We don't need a test to tell us that. And the standardized tests have had so many negative side effects, and maybe they're intended and maybe they're not intended, but they're very negative. And they do lower the self-esteem of children who consistently score at the bottom and give up and think that they can never do better. And that's the only measure of their worth, is that test, which will always make them feel inadequate. But I think there is some element in the political world that reinforces these policies because they have a negative impact on public schools and on teachers. And they want to see a whole new market orientation. And there are some of these leaders of what they call the reform movement who will wax eloquent about how wonderful it would be if we didn't have public schools, if we just closed them all down and everybody got educated over the internet or in a local for-profit school. And part of it is a kind of utopian thinking that somewhere, somehow, there is a school or a teaching method that raises up all people to be equally the same. So we had these national standards, we still do, I suppose, They're called the Common Core National Standards, completely funded by Bill Gates, hundreds of millions of dollars, but by those states because of, I mentioned in my talk, the competition in the Obama administration that if you want to have any share of $5 billion, you have to adopt these standards. And so we've had these standards now for 10 years, and the goal of them, and I wrote about this in my book, my last book, I wrote about it in Slaying Goliath. The goal of the Common Core was to wipe out all gaps. It was a crazy, crazy idea in retrospect, but it's still going on. The idea being that if everybody is taught the same thing in the same way and tested by the same test, everybody will come out the same, which is ridiculous and impossible because even in one classroom where kids have one teacher, one method, one everything, they still vary from over a long spectrum depending on their interests and most other things. But the national standards was everyone would somehow be standardized. And I can remember hearing Bill Gates speak at a conference where he said that having national standards in education was like having an electrical system where no matter where you were, you could plug into the wall and the lights would come on, the toaster would come on. Yep. And he thought that standardization made everything equal. Well, no one's going to be equal to him, no matter how much national standards there are. But, you know, my response to this is that teachers and children are not like toasters. You have the same outlet and they still come out different.
Professor Ravich, thank you so much for your discussion, for your comments, your talk, your answers, and your time. I'm aware that we've been talking for over an hour now here, and I think it's probably time to stop. Thank you very much again. I like to hand it back to the president of Oecd.
Thank you, Anna.
Okay.
So I would like to very warmly thank you on behalf of the Primary School Educators Federation. This was an excellent experience. All of those, all this information that you shared with us from the USA were valuable. We would like also to thank Anna Traianou, who moderated this event invited by our federation. I think that at some point, Ms. Ravich said that the policies that were drafted this way not only did not improve public education, but they were contrary to public education. They diminished it. This could be a sentence that would make me say that countries are alike all over the globe. Whatever happens in the USA can be seen in Greece or in the UK or in all other countries. In other words, there are instruments that are used in order to improve something, to improve education, but in the end, they make it worse. And even more, they undermine the value of the good of public education, which is destructive for educators, but even worse, it is destructive for pupils. We expected Mrs. Ravich to say this kind of things, but she was so eloquent that she made us believe that we are on the right path when we say that this is very risky to standardize this kind of instruments in order to measure educators' performances. I heard another important information about syndication and trade unions, and what Mrs. Ravich says indeed is very useful. we need to have more activation beyond the trade unions. We need families who are not near trade unions to react, because it is a matter of society. It is a matter of the families. So we don't have this bipolar situation in favor of or against trade unions, but we have common people acting on common sense. So I would like to thank Mrs. Ravitch once again. I believe that this, as the first event of a series of similar events that will follow throughout this year, will be very valuable to all. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.